Okay. All right. Okay, let's start. So welcome everyone to RMIT Distinguished Lecture. I'm Xinhui Yu, the chair of RMIT Professorial Academy, the host of this event. First, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we are meeting today. I respectfully acknowledge their elders, past and present. So today we shall hear from distinguished Professor Julian Thomas, his lecture on Wi-Fi as a social technology. This is part of the activity hosted by the Academy to fulfill its obligation as ambassador, advocate, and thought leader for RMIT. So before we start, so let's just get through some housekeeping things. And this is a team live event. You will not be able to directly ask any questions by microphones. So please post your questions in the conversation sections during the lecture. And at the end of the lecture, I will pick up those popular questions to ask the presenter on your behalf. Okay, so let's get to the lecture start by introducing the presenter. So Julian Thomas is director of the ARC Center of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society and a distinguished professor in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT. He published extensively. His latest book is on Wi-Fi, which is the very topic of this lecture. And his other projects include Australian Digital Inclusion Index, Internet on the Outstation, the Digital Divide and Remote Aboriginal Communities, and the Informal Media Economy. Thomas was elected to the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2017. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Julian to deliver his lecture. So over to you, Julian.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Xing, and it's a real pleasure. Let me just share my screen. I've got some slides, so if we just hang on a second, I'll get them up for everyone. Can everyone see my slides now? Can you see them, Xing?
Yes. Okay. It's
excellent.
Good.
Thank you. And yes, as I say, thank you again. Very privileged to have the chance to speak to the Academy and everyone here at RMIT and beyond on this topic. As you mentioned, we published a book recently about Wi-Fi, and much of what I will be saying today speaks to the content of that book and really does come out of work and conversations that I've been involved with over a number of years, especially with my colleagues Ellie Rennie and Rowan Wilkin, who co-authored that book, but also more widely with my colleagues in the Technology, Communications and Policy Lab in DIRC, our research centre, and in the new ARC centre as well. We decided to work on Wi-Fi because we thought it brought together some themes which we have been interested in jointly and severally for some time, around digital inequalities, their histories of new technologies and how they're governed and regulated, the political economy of automation and locational media, among other things. So, as well as thanks to you for inviting me to give this talk, I really should thank the university, our school, and the college for providing a very supportive and positive environment for us to pursue this work since we started at RMIT in 2017. I feel like we've come a fair way with it. It's got more and more interesting as we've gone along, partly because the context in which we've been writing about these technologies has changed so quickly. So in the talk today, I want to touch on a few things as concisely as I can. I'm going to talk a little bit about Wi-Fi's history and what we take to be its most interesting features as a social technology, as we say. The answer to the question of why Wi-Fi matters really depends on who you are and where you are. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I think that it's had significance differently and variably over time. So when we think about the history of Wi-Fi, we think that's very important for us because it gives us a very particular legacy of a kind of technical, social and policy innovation which we think is important. We think that Wi-Fi in the present is important because it has the potential to reduce vulnerabilities, to manage risks and to address long-standing and difficult problems around digital inclusion and digital inequality. We think that for the future, Wi-Fi could offer some models for a more affordable, more mobile and accessible internet, and we still think that is very important. We want to touch on the question also of what we might be the social futures for Wi-Fi. What might we really want to do with this? But to start with, let's just talk a little bit about what we take Wi-Fi to be, because it turns out to be a lot of things. It's more than the technology itself or the standard approved by the Technical Association for Wireless Communication, the IEEE standard. Wi-Fi is a brand owned and controlled by an industry association called the Wi-Fi Alliance. It's also a set of standards. It's a set of protocols for how to connect, how to set up a Wi-Fi network. It's an institution, or really a few different institutions. I mentioned the IEEE, which has a standard setting process. It's also that body, the Wi-Fi Alliance, which is really driven by a different kind of intellectual property around trademarks and controlling the use of that term. It's a bundle of contested, bitterly contested in some cases, property rights. People may be familiar with the story of CSIRO's litigation around patents for Wi-Fi related technologies. Wi-Fi is also a set of conflicting ideas about what this technology should be for and how it should be used. And of course, it's all that jumble of hardware and software which we have at home and at work, and it seems right now everywhere else. The essential thing Wi-Fi does is that it enables shared, low-cost, mobile access to the internet. And it began to do so before we had low-cost, ubiquitous, high-speed mobile broadband in any other form. So it's been very important in terms of making that mobile internet possible and everything that's flowed from that. We can think of Wi-Fi as a kind of infrastructure, and by infrastructure we're really talking about systems that are designed to move something from one place to another. Wi-Fi moves data from one place to another, it moves information. But the thing we find particularly interesting about it is that it also can shift agency and sometimes autonomy from one place to another. I'll say a little bit more about how that works or might work as we go along. It's an interesting and distinctive form of infrastructure. There's now quite a body of scholarship around the sort of social studies of infrastructure, spinning out of work on social studies of science and those kinds of areas. And people have written about how infrastructural systems are often embedded inside others, built into social arrangements and technologies. They're often an augmentation of other infrastructures. So, for example, we often find that communications infrastructures are often built on top of transport infrastructures, road and rail and so forth. Infrastructures often appear to be transparent. They're somewhat invisible. You take them for granted, usually until something goes wrong. But one of the things that's interesting about Wi-Fi is that it is different from that. Wi-Fi is visible. It's not really transparent. As you can see in that picture, almost wherever you find Wi-Fi, at least outside the household, you find brands, you find signs, you find, as on the first slide in our talk, writ large, some indication that Wi-Fi is there. So Wi-Fi is is like a lot of infrastructure and can certainly be understood in many of those ways, but it also has some very interesting differences, and we'll talk a bit more about those as well as we go along. But the critical attributes of Wi-Fi are really, from our perspective, as follows. In the first place, Wi-Fi, at least in the home and in small businesses and elsewhere, is provided by users themselves. It's an add-on, an additional device, an extension to a network which enables you to do other things, but it's generally paid for and provided by users themselves. It can be communities, as I say, can be households, but this makes a very big difference. The other thing about it which is significant, I think, is that it uses a part of the spectrum which is open for everybody. It's common spectrum. In American parlance, it's unlicensed, so that the rules around using the spectrum, which we use for Wi-Fi communications, really don't go very far beyond the basic principle that you're not supposed to interfere with other transmissions. But this is a really important point, and it's one that's made the whole thing possible. Wi-Fi is also low cost. There's so much of it, it's very, very cheap. We could say that Wi-Fi has reconfigured access to the internet. This is a reference to the internet studies scholar Bill Dutton, who talked about this in a different context. Not only does Wi-Fi change the way we access the internet, it also changes how we access the internet. So if you think about how Wi-Fi, for example, has really made smartphones possible, even working alongside cellular services, it's always been Wi-Fi, and certainly was in the first phase of smartphone generations, where it was through Wi-Fi that people could do things like download music, download apps, sync photos, do all of those kinds of fundamental things. So Wi-Fi has changed not just how we get data, but also how we use the internet. There's an interesting set of dynamics about how Wi-Fi evolves, I think. Partly because of those things that we've been talking about, the low cost, the fact that it's provided by users themselves. The evolution of Wi-Fi has been a gradual proposition. It's happened slowly over a long period of time. But another dynamic running in parallel with that gradual evolutionary development has been some step changes, usually driven by public policy and regulation. And one of the key ones there was changes in regulation that opened up that common unlicensed spectrum for use by technologies which turned out to be Wi-Fi. That goes back to the mid-1980s. So that's things that Wi-Fi does. If you look briefly at how it's developed over time, we can review that as well relatively crisply, I think. You can see a series of significant developments. Wireless communication, of course, goes right back early 20th century, and some of the critical theoretical work significantly predates anything from the 1970s or later. But we began to see experimental wireless data networks from the 1970s onwards. And AlohaNet, University of Hawaii in 1970 was one of the very first. I talked earlier about the decision to assign unlicensed spectrum, which really made Wi-Fi possible. That happened in 1985. Also an absolutely critical development, a very different approach to assigning what is a precious public resource, that's the spectrum for communications. In the past, and in many cases, spectrum has been allocated by government policy decision to particular users. In the case of free-to-air television, for example, in Australia, it was really allocated on the basis of decisions about those licensees that government thought were most appropriate to deliver those services. Later on, from the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s onwards, governments began to assign spectrum on the basis of auctions. They would go to the highest bidder. But this idea that you don't assign spectrum to a particular owner, you don't make a property right out of it, but you turn it into a common resource, is a really important one, because that's what's enabled Wi-Fi to develop in the way it has. So alongside that, as I say, there's been a steady development, a gradual progression of work towards wireless networking through the 1970s and 1980s. NCR, National Cash Register Company, their branch in the Netherlands began work on a wireless network for cash registers in the 1980s. They wanted to market that in the United States and therefore adopted that open spectrum that was made available and that really started the process of devising the standards for wireless networks, local wireless networks, which became what we now call Wi-Fi. But universities have also been, alongside those kind of commercial uses, critical areas for innovation. We've mentioned the University of Hawaii, Carnegie Mellon really developed the first significant wireless campus network in the early 1990s. Wi-Fi doesn't really become a thing for consumers or small businesses until the very end of that decade, the turn of the new millennium, when Apple releases the AirPort and a tide of other devices following the IEEE's standardization of what came to be called Wi-Fi very quickly, the 802.11 standards. So that's the story leading up to about the turn of the millennium. If we look at Wi-Fi now, the numbers really are extraordinary. As you can see, 16 billion devices in use, 4 billion devices shipped just last year. This is the single most used medium for internet traffic anywhere. You can think about just the range of the extraordinary proliferation of devices that are now connected in homes. Some researchers think that we now have around 10 devices a household on average connected, and they include all kinds of things. So moving from the early connections for laptops, printers and PCs, those kinds of things in the early 20th century, we now have that extraordinary proliferation of household devices of all kinds, and particularly and very prominently smartphones. So what's interesting there, of course, is the tension between what I've called a rather gradual process of evolution and development, several different standards being released over time, incremental improvements in bandwidth, security and so forth, on the one hand, and on the other hand, an explosion of demand. And that has created the kinds of problems that we're now all familiar with Wi-Fi, the fact that it can be unpredictably slow, it can be, the coverage can be patchy. In any given household, there may be rooms where you have good reception and spaces where you don't, but of course people are trying to work in all of these. Problems about insecurity, the insecurity of the networks, problems about privacy, problems about surveillance. So in some smart cities deployments of Wi-Fi, for example, there have been problems with tracking people through as they move through a city using Wi-Fi access points. So this is the kind of tension which has emerged around and the pressure points that have emerged around this technology in recent years. Just to say a little bit then about why Wi-Fi matters and why it is particularly significant at the moment. two scenes. You'll probably be familiar with them. Both of you may have seen these sorts of images before. The one on the left is from the south coast of New South Wales, a photo taken in the summer of 2020 after and during the period of time where bushfires were raging through that part of the east coast. And what you see there is a free Wi-Fi hotspot that's been set up by the NBN, the National Broadband Network, for people to access the internet. It's also got device charging points there. It's got spaces for people to use the internet, and you can see it's connected to a satellite connection. That's the image on the left. The one on the right wasn't taken very much later, but that's related to a totally different catastrophe, of course, which is the COVID pandemic. And what you see there is a woman called Beth Revis, who's working in the back of her car. She's a writer, and this is in a primary school in North Carolina, and she's using the Wi-Fi to work outside the school there. So these are the sorts of scenes that we've become familiar with. In the case of the bushfires, critical infrastructure was destroyed right across the east coast of Australia. Regular cellular services, regular fixed broadband, electricity, and were destroyed, and of course people needed to continue to be able to do things. They needed to be able to continue to connect with friends, family, work and colleagues. They needed to be able to communicate with health services. They needed to be able to do their banking and shopping and so forth. So this is an essential service. Wi-Fi was the fallback when everything else failed. It worked because it was so highly adaptable, so inexpensive, and so many people, of course, have the devices which connect to it. The story about the pandemic and Wi-Fi, I think is in some ways more complicated, and the circumstances of the person in the car here really reflect what happens when you don't have Wi-Fi at home, and what do you do in those circumstances. In Bateman's Bay, the solution for Wi-Fi was to get everybody together, to build a community facility. In North Carolina, it was all about keeping people apart and keeping people separate. Wi-Fi worked especially in people's homes where it was possible for people to use that technology, and where it was possible for people to do the homeschooling, to do the working from home, to maintain social contact with other people. But of course, there were so many people who didn't have those connections and were in the circumstances where they had to rely on a school. But what happened in the pandemic, of course, was that that household Wi-Fi became absolutely critical. Public Wi-Fi evaporated or diminished. The Wi-Fi provided by the school is an exception. What happened much more often was that schools, libraries, cafes and other places where people could access Wi-Fi if they didn't have it tended to go. So whereas the public space after the bushfires brought people together to use this at a community level, with North Carolina, it was all about how people could be kept apart and still have some kind of access to this technology. To talk a little more about the social dynamics of the problems this has caused, we can a couple of pieces of research here, which I think are helpful. Who has Wi-Fi helped, and where do people need assistance? How have we managed with Wi-Fi in the pandemic. So the figure on the left is a matrix of risk profiles for people's exposure to COVID-19. And the bottom axis, the horizontal one, goes from fewer digital resources, more unconnected people, to more connected people on the right-hand side. On the vertical axis, we're going from bottom to top, from sheltered circumstances to more exposed. We're tracking the degree to which people are exposed to a risk of COVID-19. And you can see that there's a quadrant there which is the sheltered and connected, and these are the people that Wi-Fi helped most of all. As I say, somebody working out of the back of a car near a school was not really entirely in that category. They were exposed but connected and at higher risk. The strategy, of course, was to try to work and stay in the vehicle. So it's a significant point that while Wi-Fi was enormously important in enabling people to carry on with work, with schooling, with social connections through the pandemic, it wasn't there for everybody, and it depended, in fact, on other people taking risks and being more exposed. If we think about who the sorts of people are who were more vulnerable, you can see some of that in the chart on the right, which shows the social distribution of digital inclusion in Australia in 2019, measured by our project, our Digital Inclusion Index project, work of colleagues in our lab and at Swinburne Centre for Social Impact. And you can sort of see there just how significant the differences are in digital resources across our society, whether you look at income or employment or education or age. There are stark differences, so that when we are in the sorts of circumstances we're in now, some people are at vastly more risk than others. And you can see in particular that when we look at measures of digital inclusion and we're talking about people's access to internet devices, to data, we're talking about affordability, we're talking about the digital skills they have, all of those things brought together in this measure, you can see that our lowest income households are particularly exposed, and also people aged over 65. So two key groups, highly vulnerable and with significantly fewer digital resources than the rest of the population. So Wi-Fi is quite important for this. You can see this a little bit by seeing what sort of happened over time here with this. So on the right here, you've got two charts which track the differences for digital inclusion for the richest quintile of Australians and the poorest. On the top, the income gap, and down the bottom, the age gap. What you see is that hasn't changed really significantly in either case since we started collecting data on this back for 2014. So why do we think that is? The chart on the left gives you some ideas about that. That shows the trends for digital inclusion when we divide it up according to the different dimensions of access, affordability, and digital ability. So you can see there that access for Australians, access to the internet, access to digital resources has improved steadily and significantly over the last 5-6 years. And that's because very substantial investments have been made in fixed broadband and in mobile broadband services. When you look at the measure of digital ability, you can see that that has also improved, but it's a lagging indicator compared to the access compared to the data, the devices, the network, hardware, infrastructure, all of that kind of thing. The skills are lagging behind the infrastructure there. But the one that's of very significant concern, I think, is affordability. That's our measure of how much of a person's household income they're having to devote to internet services and what they're getting for their dollar. And you can see that with some downs and some little ups, it's basically flat. So that hasn't improved. And we do think that this is exactly where Wi-Fi is going to be particularly important, because it is low cost, because it is shareable. It has a very important role there. So that's where we see the situation in the present. Wi-Fi has considerable possibilities. It has made possible all kinds of things during the pandemic, which we would simply not otherwise have been able to do. It has kept people together, it's kept people working, it's enabled homeschooling for what it is worth, but it's also been the case that significant numbers of people have been excluded, whether excluded from work, having to be in a position where their risks have been much greater because they've been exposed, or if they're older, have been isolated because they don't have connections. So our point here is Wi-Fi has been tremendously important in Bateman's Bay and in North Carolina in the face of quite different catastrophes, but there's still very substantial work to do. So turning to the future then, we're dealing here with this question of whether or not an affordable, mobile, accessible internet is going to be possible as we move on with a rapidly accelerating digital transformation. I talked a little earlier about the two paces, the dynamic of gradual evolution for Wi-Fi combined with the occasional step change especially in regulatory settings. And I think this is the kind of situation we are now in, and where we need to work through. Wi-Fi has gradually improved, it's gradually evolved, but there is an extraordinary momentum around an increasing density of connections, diversity of connections. So you've got remarkable, intensive and extensive growth in how people are connecting to the internet, and so how much they're online and the range of things they're doing online have both grown very dramatically. And of course, COVID, the pandemic, has played a major role in that. So on the one hand, you have that gradual evolution of the technology. On the other hand, you have this extraordinary explosion of demand. So you do not have a Wi-Fi at the moment, which is necessarily dealing with this terribly well. The sorts of problems that we talked about earlier, the difficulties about managing network connections at home, when children are online at school, when adults are working, when people are syncing photos, podcasts, everything else at the same time, when we're relying on this technology for social communication, connection and entertainment. Clearly the entire system is under a good deal of pressure. Managing, yes, much better than it might have been because of the NBN, certainly, but under pressure nevertheless. So there is change that is happening. The other kind of critical trend, which I think is congruent with this, happening at the same time, also enormously significant, is a shift in how we are using these connected devices. So we're no longer simply using our Wi-Fi in order to connect to communication and information services. We're also increasingly using these systems for automated devices of the kind that are proliferating in households. I've mentioned many of them before. I've got an image there of a couple of smart speakers to give you a little idea of the kinds of things people now do with Wi-Fi, which is rather different from the previous model of connecting a laptop to the web for the purposes of browsing, for the purposes of email, for the purposes of accessing, of downloading files or applications. So it's a very different sort of environment, but we're still using the old Wi-Fi in order to try and do it. So the immediate strategies for the Wi-Fi Alliance and the companies behind the technology of Wi-Fi and the IEEE standards processes around this has been to develop the next generation of Wi-Fi, which they call Wi-Fi 6. They've rebranded Wi-Fi in recent years in order to compete more effectively with cellular services. We're all familiar with the cellular typology of 3G, 4G, 5G. So now Wi-Fi has done the same thing. They've abandoned that complicated alphabet soup of different standards, numbers and letters to go for something which is ostensibly simpler. So they've gone, so we now have Wi-Fi 6, as I say, a gradual evolution, but an interesting one in that it's intended to do a number of different things. It is of course designed to increase the bandwidth available, to increase the perceived speed of services. It's designed to manage that multiplicity of devices that are now connected much better than in the past. It's designed to improve security, and it's designed to improve the energy use of devices, especially those that use batteries, and more of them do. It's designed also to attempt to develop some new domains and new technologies for Wi-Fi. So places where in the past there hasn't been a lot of it. So the idea is that in hospitals, for example, it may be that secure Wi-Fi networks are used for automated systems through the, for the digital management of patients, of systems behind them, the kinds of equipment that are required there, and also, of course, for patients themselves. It's envisaged that Wi-Fi could become increasingly important at live performance, whether sport or other kinds of performance, where people may want to watch and see things on a screen alongside live action. Clearly also advertising is likely to be involved in that. So they're the sort of immediate futures, and we're already starting to see that sort of slightly improved version of Wi-Fi starting to appear. It's more interesting is something else called Wi-Fi 6E, and trying not to get overly technical about this, but this goes back to the earlier discussion about spectrum allocation. And what's happened here is that after very many years, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States has decided to allocate a substantial additional block of spectrum to those unlicensed uses, which of course include Wi-Fi. So this is now being described by the Wi-Fi Alliance as Wi-Fi 6E, and is likely to increase the spectrum, the bandwidth available for Wi-Fi at home and elsewhere by around 4 times. So this is partly also to address the kinds of problems we encounter with Wi-Fi in our increasingly densely occupied urban environments, in blocks of apartments where people are living nearby each other, and we're getting lots of interference across different Wi-Fi networks in mass transit and so on. This is an example of the kind of step change I was talking about that has the capacity and the potential to entirely change the kinds of things Wi-Fi can do. There are a number of questions that arise out of those immediate futures that I think are challenging for the proponents of Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi Alliance has a slogan about the future of Wi-Fi, which is about how Wi-Fi is going to be it's going to be everywhere, it's going to be for everyone, and it's going to do everything. That really needs to be picked apart a bit. We're seeing an increasingly complex relationship with cellular services, and this plays out in many different ways. My colleagues Rowan Wilkin and James Meese are beginning an ARC discovery project on the political economy and regulation of 5G, and I think it'll be extraordinarily interesting to follow that work, because of course 5G and 4G have both emerged as, in many respects, preferred networks, faster services than Wi-Fi, more reliable in many cases. Clearly Wi-Fi doesn't want to be perceived to be second best, but the whole idea of Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6G is about competing with that brand, that 5G brand. But the other point about this, and this occurred to me actually a little while ago when we started writing this book about Wi-Fi. The publishers sent it out to a few readers, and one of them wrote back saying, "Why are you bothering? Just write about 5G. That's really all that matters now. Wi-Fi is in the past." But when you explore this a little further, what we find is that Wi-Fi isn't quite in the past, because in fact 5G and 4G are likely to make very substantial use of Wi-Fi, and 4G already does. So these are intertwined and interconnected services rather than simple competitors. Some analysts, Cisco has a report suggesting that it could be that up to 70% of mobile traffic on 4 and 5G networks may be offloaded to Wi-Fi within the next couple of years, because it's simply more economical and easier for them to do that when networks become congested than building their own surge capacity into purely 5G or 4G networks. So there's an interesting coexistence there and codependence. A lot of the technologies we find in Wi-Fi 6 are actually also derived from those cellular technologies. There are geopolitical dimensions. I've got a little map there. You can see where 6E is starting to happen and where it's not. And it's very clear that in China and in some other countries, the argument is that that spectrum which FCC wants given over to a spectrum commons ought to be sold to 5G carriers, because that will be where the demand is. And there are also, of course, an ongoing series of questions about the relationships between Wi-Fi and digital platforms and the platform economies that sustain them. Wi-Fi was born before the big digital platforms, as we know. That Apple Airport came out at a time when Google was 1 year old. There seem to have been, in fact there have been, various attempts to build platforms out of Wi-Fi, particularly advertising supported ones. But apart from some isolated cases, that hasn't happened so far. And Wi-Fi remains a relatively adaptable, ubiquitous and widely usable infrastructure that has not been captured by any single digital platform. All of that raises, I guess, my last set of questions, which are really about what I would call the social futures of Wi-Fi. What might it become if it is shaped by policy and by design, not purely by commercial ideas or technical agendas closely associated with those? I would say that looking at Wi-Fi's past, there have been examples of social futures at play. I think the Federal Communications Commission, when it decided to allocate that spectrum for unlicensed use, was imagining a social, what we would call a social future. And certainly the vibrant community networking movement of the 2000s, which drove a whole agenda around community and metropolitan Wi-Fi, participated in that sort of thinking. So the question is now then, when we're seeing these more automated networks where Wi-Fi is no longer just about transmitting data, but also about generating it and using it in all sorts of different ways, how could Wi-Fi continue to support not just a basic infrastructure, a basic data network, but also that key point that I talked about at the beginning, the redistribution of agency in an increasingly automated environment. So I'll finish just with one quick example of that, Jing, and then I hope we have time for questions. But coming back to the university, as I said, universities have always played a critical role in Wi-Fi innovation. We now face enormous problems, of course, in terms of welcoming students back onto our campuses and managing risks for those people. If you think about that quadrant of risk profiles I talked about earlier, we all know that the people who are safe at home and have Wi-Fi are fine. But what when we have people who are coming onto campus? How can we manage this? So I was interested in the work of colleagues at Melbourne University and Deathlefs and colleagues there who have written in the IEEE Spectrum recently about ways in which a university campus Wi-Fi network could be used to show how people could be, the movement of people across campuses could be used to make campuses safer for densities, identifying zones with targeting areas with ventilation and so forth, encouraging social distancing. So this seems like it could be the way forward to why we might want to see a responsible use of this extraordinary technology, which has both promised a great deal, delivered much, and disappointed in equal measure, but a responsible use that could help us rebuild our communities' conditions. Thanks very much, Jing. I'll finish it there.
Thank you very much, Julian, for a fascinating talk. So while we are waiting for questions, so I just take the privilege as a chair, to ask a few questions. So you mentioned about the RMIT standard. If you look at the history you displayed, how this standard was developed in a relatively peaceful period of time. There's one country dominating all the technology. And in my experience in the RMIT, you basically through a quite democratic process, having this kind of a common user come together to eventually develop standards so everybody share. I was wondering whether in the future, this type of technologies, the development of the democratic process will be impacted by the confrontation of the superpowers. That's the big. Because in the developing RMIT standard, you see the domination of major vendors. They come here, they say, we want this standard. That's the whole, all the product we produced, you have to follow. So you do see some of the vendor domination, but I'm just worried that in this new uncertain, the world, so those kind of technologies which has benefit the humankind would be sort of impacted. It means that you would have a derivative from government saying you're not supposed to use that technology, you should use this one. So it's kind of a divide rather than united the world together.
Oh, I agree, and I think it is a really very significant risk. I think we're sort of seeing this a little bit already. We're seeing the emergence of a competing Wi-Fi 6 developed and advocated for by Huawei, which is using different part of the spectrum and has different kinds of features. As I say, I think Wi-Fi 6E, this new generation intended to use that new part of the spectrum, there is no international consensus yet that this is the future of Wi-Fi. No international consensus in the sense of no global consensus. So we may well see the sort of splintering that you're talking about. The IEEE is fascinating. It has worked extraordinarily effectively in the circumstances you talked about. But I think actually the CSIRO cases were an example of how a particular source of innovation which came from outside that group was very disruptive.
Yeah.
And clearly there is the potential for a lot more of that in the future.
But how do you see this kind of Wi-Fi technology, drive the narrow the gap between poor and the rich? Because you see the mixed messages. You see the in the Africa, in the remote area, there was no electricity, but they can do the communication, right? They can phone. They just put the pole there, put a bit of battery, then they talk to each other. And you thought that, well, that's probably will narrow the gap. But on the other hand, you see that the urbanization, people moving to cities. But how do you see those kind of technology driving this kind of social change? I mean, there's a plus and a negative thing, right?
Oh, absolutely, there are, and but I do think Wi-Fi is a critical part of the mix, partly because it's so adaptable, it's so low cost. And the critical thing, I think, is that it can be managed and to some degree controlled by communities themselves. So, for example, when we think about Wi-Fi community networks in remote Indigenous networks in Australia, and my colleague Ellie Rennie talks a little bit about these in the book. A critically important aspect of these is that to some extent the communities may be able to manage these networks, to control them themselves in ways which they may not be able to do with others. So it's not just about providing the access. It's this point also that I was coming back to in the talk, that what Wi-Fi does or can do is redistribute agency, and that is the key, I think, to the sort of social change that you're talking about, giving people control of some of this technology, and this is one way, certainly not the only way, but one way in which they can do it. Yeah, for sure. Okay,
thanks, Julian. I haven't seen any new question come along. Well, it appears to be everybody's very happy with your talk. And
everybody's questions about what?
Yeah. So if there's no further question, I think we're just about time. We're just a few minutes before the closing time. And so thank you very much, Julian, for a fascinating talk. And hopefully, we will listen to your talk in the future. And also, thank everyone. So hopefully you will attend to the next distinction lecture. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye for now.